folks, we're going to take and see how great the expectations are. This evening, I want to take and apologize first off because we're going to talk about a divided idea around the Article 5 discussion, the confusion of it. As you heard Dave mention just earlier, there's going to be a big 3-day conference of stopping a con-con. Well, you know what? We don't want a constitutional convention. Number one, the Constitution does not allow for one. Right. So that's part of the confusion. A lot of reasons for the confusion is the whole fact that our educational system has not kept any of us abreast of the truths that our founding fathers wanted to have. All of you know that. All of you in this room are aware of that. Well, I have to apologize because I know that a lot of you are going to, especially when I get to the end of this and talk about action items, you probably know that. But there's a lot of other folks that don't. And so I'm going to make some of you very, very angry to the point that you may want to walk out. And that's okay. Or I'm going to make you so angry that you want to really get engaged in action. Right. Because that's what it's going to take. That's what it's all about. That's what our founders wanted. Action. And it was all about one thing. Not all of these disparate ideas, not all about these disparate issues, because they had every single one of what we're experiencing today, except some of the very immoral ones. Because morality was very strong during the founding era. There were immoral people, yes, but the principles that were there that established this nation were fundamentally strong in the moral arena. But everything else, economy, banking, industry, fishing, you name it, property rights, they were absolutely aware of it. So again, I'm going to apologize if I make you angry. And if I don't, then I didn't do my job tonight. And that's for sure. So I have to start out with is that, you know, I'm not an attorney. I wouldn't like you, Tom. I wouldn't want to claim to be an attorney. My mother wanted me to be an attorney, but I said, no, thank you very much, Mom. You know, the other thing was a dentist, and I just couldn't, you know, see looking into people's mouths all my life. But I'm glad there are those that do. But I am a citizen, no different than you. But I qualify myself, as you most often heard when I do the Tale of Two Constitutions, a little bit different as a citizen. I look at myself as a citizen from between that period of about 1774 to 1810. And the reason I say that is because I know how to read, first and foremost. I understand the events of the Revolution, which that's what we were supposed to do, understand those events of the Revolution. I know that most people that were in business, were in the trades, that were enterprising, did international work, they not only understood common law. See, the people understood common law. But not only that, those that were generally in business in that understood the English law and justice system. That was amazing. Everybody had a concept of what it meant on the English law and justice, especially those that were in business in that. So that's interesting. They also knew about what their state conventions were all about. You see, conventions aren't anything new from our founders' perspective, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the idea of a convention and what that meant, they experienced the whole time that America was being formed. And what was very, very interesting is that the state conventions in particular, when they were defining their own states' constitutions, were open to the public. And people participated. They understood exactly what the delegates were supposed to do, what the responsibilities were, how that should act and form. See, all the citizens had a good idea about that. The other thing is that had a good sense about the Articles of Confederation. You see, that came about out of and right after the Declaration of Independence. You got to remember, we were under a form of constitution, although it didn't get ratified right away, but the Articles of Confederation were our federal government that we operated under, which meant there was a Congress. And that Congress was seated, and representatives were sent annually. And there was a president, and so on. They had rules, they had action, they had things they had to work under. And the states, yeah, there were things wrong with it. There were things that were, that needed to be fixed. But the fact was, we were already under a federal government from during the whole revolution and after for a number of years. So I understood that as a citizen of that period. I read the Federalist arguments. Newspaper articles, folks. Newspaper articles. That's all the Federalist arguments, or what is known as the Federalist Papers, are. There were newspaper arguments. At the same time, I read the Contrarian Position, which became known as the Anti-Federalist. Those Anti-Federalist papers, newspaper articles. And you want to know something? Not everybody, admittedly, well, it was over 70% of the population could read. Yeah. People don't realize that. Those that couldn't would come into gatherings as like this, and somebody would read those newspaper articles. And guess what? They would have this public forum and gathering, and they would discuss that. They would discuss what was being said during that period of time, and what was the positions for the Constitution, and what were the positions against, and why. I knew that. I participated in that. I've read them. I continue to read them. As many of you know, I've studied these for over 20-some years. Okay. I understood that during my state's ratifying convention, it was open. You see, the convention of '87 was a closed convention. And the notes that came out of that convention of '87 didn't appear for 50 years. So what happened was you had the Federalist Papers that were arguing for, but more importantly, and the first Congress says this, history says this, as well as some professors, which academics are what they are, but what they say is that what was important was each state ratifying convention, and what the citizenry understood during that convention period, what came out of that in the newspaper articles. You can read the notes from every one of the states ratifying conventions. You can read the newspaper articles about them, and it tells you what was understood about the Constitution as it was being argued during that ratification period. Very, very clear. So when the Constitution was ratified, it was the understanding that came out of those states' conventions by which then the first and early Congresses made decisions of implementation. There was not only the objective words that were defined or said, but because of English law and customs and justice, they understood that you had to go find the meaning of the word and what those words meant. So that's what they were arguing during those ratifying. What did those words mean? What were the principles by which they were being understood? How was that being defined, and how was that going to implement? And most importantly, how was it going to affect my liberty, your liberty? What did that mean for your property? See, that's what it was all about. Those were the things that were being argued. That was what was understood that should happen in a convention. You know what? I paid attention to what happened in that first, second Congress. I knew those representatives that were going. I knew what was happening because you know what? We got together in local groups like this. And in doing so, we sat down and we argued. We talked about those principles. And when we selected that person to go represent us at the national level, we knew who they were, and they were being held accountable. And not only that, especially from the Senate perspective, because the senator was selected by the state legislator, they were recallable. And they had to do what that state legislators expected to happen. And you know something? I voted for my state legislator. I knew them personally. You see? And I'd go knock on your door if you weren't doing something right. I'd come up to you and say, John, isn't it about time you really stand in line with our principles? You know? You're representing us in the state. And you know what? That senator, he's not doing what's good for all of us all the way down to the people. Why don't you take and snap him back around? Can't do that nowadays. You see? Most importantly, I was active. I was active in local issues, and as those local issues then became points of interest from that national perspective, I was involved in that. You know, that's the citizen from 74 to about 1810. That was that perspective, you see? It was interesting. So I want to give you a couple of my opinions. This is, you know, for note takers if you're interested. The confusion over the last 50 years, as I stated earlier, is all based on our educational system not wanting us to know the principles by which we were founded and by which we should govern. And as we're hearing from the courses on self-governance, self-govern. It's not about who you elect, send to the legislature, send to Congress, and they're going to do it all for you. No, 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 no. They're supposed to represent us based on how we interact with them and determine for them what they need to take and represent us with. Another opinion that I have is that the modern citizenry isn't taught about this whole idea from a constitutional perspective of how it functions, its history, its basis. There's a lot of constitutional classes out there, but you know what? We still haven't done a lot of them. I try to put together programs to teach them. A good friend of mine, Vera, was showing me Dr. Glenn Kimber, who teaches a lot. I learned his constitutional classes, and I teach those, you know, when I get the chance to do it. But man, it's hard. People don't want to take the time for it, you know. Churches have failed. The First Great Awakening was something amazing, and it was all about liberty. And the churches have failed since the mid-1800s. And that's a whole talk unto itself that I can do and have done. But it is an amazing thing that happened, and we went from the purity of the gospel in America to the social gospel to whatever many, many churches are calling it now, to where we see many of the major denominations are allowing such perversion that our founding fathers just would look back at, let alone the Lord God himself. Right. So that had an effect, because what was happening is that when people started coming into America in droves, instead of taking and looking and staying focused on liberty within the context of the First Great Awakening, they thought they could make social changes. Yeah. Geez, you hear anything about social changes now? So the churches got involved in these social changes that drove political stuff, and I'll call it stuff, instead of taking and standing on the principles of the foundation. And those principles started with a good gospel biblical message, and then moved forward into what it meant into the political realm. Conservative groups, especially that emerged in the 70s, fantastic groups that started out even earlier, like John Birch Society, Eagle Forum. You know, Phyllis Schlafly did a fantastic thing in stopping the Equal Rights Amendment. Fabulous work. That was a bad amendment. Yep. It was bad. They backdoored all the stuff anyway. Congress backdoored it in. But the fact is that that was hard work that she did. You know, I got to just say that, you know, the Young Americans for Freedom, and there was a lot of neoconservatives. You know, I got an email from a friend up in Spokane. We've been having this discussion and with a lot of folks. And he says, hey, I just got this in from, you know, some Birchers and that. And I'm a Bircher, you know, as well. But the fact is, I don't agree with a lot of the things they're doing right now. But the fact is that they're going, hey, you know what? here's some stuff from Judge Bork. Here's some stuff from this one and this one and this one that are against a Article 5 Convention of the States. Well, you know, I had to go do my homework. You know, as much as you think about Bork and that term as he went through the process about getting borked, well, I learned he's a neocon. He's a neocon. Wow. Okay. Other folks that you probably know of, Bill Kristol, Paul Wolfowitz, Louis Libby, Norm Pondhorst, Richard Pipes, Charles Krauthammer, Richard Pearl, Robert Kagan, Elliot Abrams, and Ben Wattenberg, all neocons. So what is the interest? As I say in The Tale of Two Constitutions, when the argument was going with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in particular, and they were talking about when is it from the point of the special interest to take and allow a change in the Constitution, to have an amendment. Well, you know what? If someone is wanting to do that and it's in their interest, oh, let's go for it. Let's go for it. But when the people rise up and say, no, we want our rights restored, we want government for and by the people restored, the special interests sit there and they go, oh, no, you can't do that. You know what? Here's a fear here. Here's a fear there. Here's this here. We're going to talk about some of that. We're going to talk about some of that. Also, in my opinion, you know, the great institutions that have worked on policy, these institutions, Heritage Foundation, Cato, a lot of the others, you know what? They've affected, interestingly, public policy to the extent that sometimes things get passed as legislation, and it works. They're doing fantastic jobs. But you know something? When I look back over these last 50 years, they haven't done anything locally, effectively, that has made the change. And guess what? The reason the insanity is going on in Congress right now is because they looked at the national issues and nobody's been paying attention to how we get our states back, and we take it over and we move things forward so we can stand as a people and as a state. Right. Exactly. You know something? States' rights. Yeah. We have that right. That's something we have to remember. The states have the right to petition for a convention and amendments. Not a constitutional change, but to petition for amendments. We'll talk about that. So, I'm an opinionated guy. In my opinion also, it's the resurgence of what's happening in this room right now. We the people, 9/12, Tea Party, all of the groups that are coming together as citizens that are saying enough, and we want to restore what is rightfully ours for not only today, but for our posterity. Right. I keep looking at my grandkids and my heart is ripped out of me. Yeah. Because they're slaves and you know what? They don't know it. They're slaves and they don't know it. So, you know, thank you. Thank all of you for being here today, because it's because of you that we're going to restore our nation to the greatness that it should be. And that's what it's about. And remember, I always say this when I do my Samuel Adams event also, is that the Tea Party was a one-time event. It's the spirit of liberty that has to carry us forward. That's what keeps us going. It's the spirit of liberty. And you know something? Voter fraud's nothing new. You know, voter fraud was an amazing thing that happened, and the corruption and the worst things that happened were in 1824. 1824 presidential election was one of the dirtiest, nastiest elections that was ever articulated in history. John Quincy Adams and who? Mr. Jackson. Adams, you know, it was an interesting time. And then there was a negotiation that happened. Corruption, mudslinging, one another, calling one another all sorts of things, bringing up lies out the ears. of anything from womanizing, drunkenness, you name it. What can you think of? It was that bad. In 28, it was as bad again. Andrew Jackson being reelected because they didn't want, he was standing against the national bank. Yeah. And it then turned into the banking wars in the 1830s. But the whole idea was they were bad. There was a history written about Fisher Ames, and it was done by an Englishman. And he was bringing out in the introduction to that book, it was real interesting because he was saying the corruption in the elections in America only is less than what we're seeing somewhat here in England. And this was during that period of 1824 to 1832. And he said at that time, people were being taken by the arm, drunk as can be, hauled in to vote. People who had no right from a property perspective were taken in to vote. Wait a minute, people were being signed up, and they didn't bus them at that time, but they were bringing them in by the wagon full to vote in multiple places. People died in Philadelphia because of the riots that were going on during the elections. Then there was this crazy thing that started happening during that period of time in New York in particular. Who knows about the New York machine? What was that called? Tammany Hall. Yeah. Tammany Hall was that machine. And it was a machine of corruption for not only national elections, but local and state elections. See? There's nothing new.
Sounds like Acorn.
Tom, if you go back to Jefferson, even then they were
Mudslinging.
Yeah.
Mudslinging. Oh yeah, there was a lot of mudslinging all along. Even Washington's second term, there was mudslinging during that. So, you know, this whole thing about tolerance and we have to be, what's the word that they say, we not kind to one another, but what is it?
Politically correct.
Well, not politically correct, but civility. There was no civility. There's never been civility. You know, it's a manipulation by the left. Okay? Anyway, those are my opinions. So, you know, I'm not opinionated at all. But the history of conventions, we're going to cover that. That's what this is all about, what you're really interested. You know, conventions are nothing new, folks. Conventions are absolutely nothing new. I mean, we'll talk about it, and I'll show you. The conventions, they started out in the 1600s. Conventions in the 1600s. So you think that the idea that we should have some history and knowledge of how a convention should work? Yeah. You know, we're going to talk about the ideas that you're stupid. Yeah, you're too stupid. The public is too stupid to understand the process. Well, the only reason we're stupid about the process is because the educational system wants us to be stupid. Okay? So if we're stupid about the process, I apologize. It's not necessarily your fault, but on the other hand, it is. You know? What are the distractors of liberty saying, and what are they saying that making it so strong to overcome? We know that the progressives, let's just call them what they are, the communists want to really take over the country, so they're using this term con, and they want to push a con and all of that. Whereas that's not what the Constitution allows for. So the progressives are trying to do some of that, and they're trying to jump on the bandwagon of what's right. Yeah, Mark.
I call them liberal, progressive, socialist, atheist, Democrats.
There you go.
Yeah, there you go. You know, yeah.
And you don't have to worry about missing anybody.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. That works. That works. So, also what we're going to cover today a little bit is this a constitutional convention that people are talking about, which I already stated some of my opinion on. What is the process? What is it? How does it work? And what must be done by whom? So I want to preface a couple of things, is that the Convention of '87 was not a runaway convention. Not at all. So you'll hear that from a lot of the groups. The Birchers say that, even, you know, Phyllis Schlafly has said that, a number of other conservatives groups. They raise up this fear. Oh, the '87 convention was a runaway convention. Folks, it was not. It was absolutely not. As a matter of fact, there's a couple things that I have to sell these because, you know, I'm not a nonprofit, so, you know, they're $2 each. But it has in here from a guy that must have been listening to me over the last, you know, 25 years, a Dr. Robert Nadelson, and some people boo-hoo him. Here's an article out of the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, and it was written well after our president was ever at Harvard. But the point is, this article in here is called The Article 5 Convention Process and the Restoration of Federalism. We're going to talk about some of the things that he brings out, but then the other thing, why this was not a runaway, was because James Madison talked about it. Really? Yeah. You know where he talked about it? Federalist number 40. Federalist number 40 is absolutely clear that they had the full authority to do what they did. You see, they took as their guiding documents what happened at the Maryland conference the year before, and that was suggesting and it was defining that needed to make some changes in different things. And you want to know something? We were under, what did I say earlier? We were under the Articles of Confederation. We had a Congress. And you know something? That Congress wrote a resolution and gave them authority to convene the convention, and it outlined what they could do. So you know what? Congress gave the permission to make the changes in government. There was really only one thing that they did outside of the realm and authority that they had, and what that was is that they changed the ratification process from all 13 states to 9. That was the only thing they did outside of their authority, and Madison talks about that. He's very, very clear on that. And the reason they did that was because they did not want all of the states that were interested in forming a new federal government to be held up by one state. You see, because under the Article of Confederation, you had to have all 13 states ratify it to make it work. Whereas with 9, then the others could join or not join. And there were issues with Connecticut and one of the Carolinas. Also, what he talks about and what historically is formed is that 2 states in particular sent very explicit and specific guidelines for their delegates, Massachusetts and New York. They told them that they could not vote on any new constitution. 2 of the Massachusetts delegates chose to violate their trust. They violated their trust. They voted for the new Constitution and signed it. Elbridge Gerry did not. Okay? The New York delegation followed their trust and actually walked out of the convention except for one person, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton begged to sign the Constitution, and it was an invalid signature because the delegation, he could not vote by delegation authority from his state of New York. He could not legally vote for the Constitution, but he wanted his name put down in history, so he signed it, was allowed to sign it, but New York never allowed for the Constitution. That's why they were one of the last ones to ratify it. And they pressed for amendments. You see? So these are the types of things that were interesting that were going on. So we know that it was well within their authority, their scope of authority to do. And one of the interesting things was that the '87 Congress allowed the Constitution to go out. You know, the idea is that the convention would bring the document back to Congress. And it was only because Congress said, we're going to let you put it out to the states for ratification. They could have killed it.
Yeah.
They could have said right there, no, this isn't what we really wanted you to do. Go back and do something else. That Congress had that absolute and authority and right to stop it right there in its tracks. You have to understand, they even allowed the change of the ratification process. So they allowed it to go from 13 to 9, but it had to be ratified by the states. Okay? Congress allowed it to go out. So the ratification process then went to the conventions within each and every state. That's some of the history. That's some of the history of it. And last is that each of those states, their conventions were open conventions. They were not closed conventions as the Philadelphia Convention. Each one of them, as I mentioned earlier, you could read the records of those conventions. You can read the 87 record now, but during that period of ratification, because the reporters were sitting in the room. They were taking the notes. They were reporting daily on what was happening inside of those conventions. So it was always an open forum to the public to clearly understand what was happening. Well, as we progress, I want you to remember something. Why is it?
And for future generations, a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law. Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge. Now we can see a new world coming into view. A world in which there is a very real prospect of a new world order.
The Council on Foreign Relations, known as the CFR, an organization publicly sworn to destroy American national sovereignty and usher in a tyrannical world police state, could not contain their glee on September 12th, the day after the tragic attack. They announced their New World Order.
There is a chance for the President of the United States to use this disaster to carry out what his father, a phrase his father used, I think, only once, and hasn't been used since, and that is a new world order. World order.
You see? That's what we're fighting against. That's what it's all about, folks. This is what we, the people, you know, it's not King George 3,000 miles away. It's those organizations only 1,700 miles away, depending on where we are.
Well, but
Yeah.
globally.
Yes, but the fact is that it's in our backyard. Well, you know, who push it open all the way and just leave it for a minute. And who's seen this before? Who's seen this? You know, I mean, this is a pretty famous flag. You know what this flag came about? This flag came about in the year when? When do you think this flag came out? When was that? Yeah, before the internet. 1754. 1754. We'll talk about this a little bit more. This was at the convention or the conference of Albany, New York. 1754. This is what Benjamin Franklin ran in his newspaper about join or die. So this is Ben Franklin. You know, he was at the 1754 convention. We'll talk about that a little